Hello, everyone. Super happy to be back in the city of Krakow. I had the wonderful opportunity to live here for 2 years some time ago, so it's a bit of a nostalgic trip for me now. And super happy to be on Digital Dragons this time as a speaker. So, if you don't mind, I'll jump in right in the presentation because it's a rather long one, and I'd rather not have to skip parts of it. So, our topic is narrative through gameplay, which can mean a lot of things. I basically cannot cover all of them, but hopefully I'll be able to provide you with some ideas of how that can be achieved. My name is Yasen Stoynev, and I'm currently a lead level designer in Flying Wild Hog. I've got like around 12 years of level design experience in the industry, in which I've done level design, quest design, mostly focused on the level part. And yeah, I went through a couple of studios in my career and worked on quite a few titles. They have narrative coverage to a different extent, some of them less, some of them more, and they all tackle it differently. So I'm going to start with a few basics, which I'll literally breeze through, because these are topics that we definitely don't have time to talk about, but I believe are super important, and I believe people that are serious about narrative in their games, even if they're not writers or narrative designers, they will know a thing or two about. So the first is the classic free act structure. This is something I believe every designer, doesn't matter game level or narrative, should be pretty familiar with and have ways to use it in their designs. The other super important thing, it was mentioned actually on a couple of lectures already as well, that's the monomyth, the hero's journey, and the book. So I won't be going in detail about this. It's a pretty cool book. You don't have to have read it all, but there's like plenty of like super short summaries online, some of them created for writers, but they can give you a pretty good high-level idea of character arcs, character growth, and the hero's journey as a general. And a couple of other kind of high-level things that I personally strongly believe in, and they help me with designs. Like one is so-called gradual storytelling and the pacing of your narrative and the ability to keep the mystery alive by delaying story elements and using only what you must say, things that you could postpone for later, and things that you can eventually even not tell players. I strongly believe that we give too much to players for free often. So the other is obviously conflict. Conflict is the fuel of your story, is the fuel of your gameplay, and you should really know how to work with conflict and create conflict, not in your game dev department, but in your game. You should know about different types of conflict, internal and external, and tension and drama, and how to create and handle that, and how to apply it in gameplay. So believability is also a super important thing. How to create relatable and believable characters, credible worlds and events, and so on, so that your world is consistent and coherent. Another super important technique for designers, not just for story, is how to plant and seed, and how to get payoffs for that later, and foreshadowing as well, of course, because this really is a key technique to engaging players and creating a satisfying story, a satisfying player experience, and so on. And coincidences, like, you know, these moments in the movie, oh, yeah, sure, of course, things are going to work out like that. It's so convenient for the story. So you should know about different types of coincidences, how to handle them, the really bad type of coincidences, the ones you could potentially live with, and again, how to avoid them completely or mask them to some extent. So there's plenty of reading material online about this. I'm definitely not the person to go in detail about this. And the last thing here is like explicit, implicit storytelling, and the unique to our game medium, emergent storytelling. So you should be familiar with all of them and mix those techniques in your designs and know how to present a story with each one of them. So another couple of key values here before we deep dive. Obviously, I believe a story should be more interactive. This is what this talk is about. We know the cliche, show, don't tell, and the extension that comes with game dev, which is like make players do, make players play, don't just even show them stuff. In general, I strongly believe players are much more invested in stories that they actively participate through gameplay. If you want them to care about a character, develop that character through gameplay, and the same applies to your stories. And these are the more memorable stories. Like, I don't know about you, but for me, the most memorable stories I have in game dev across all genres are ones that are told through characters in many cases and through gameplay, or ideally a combination of both. So, yeah, in general, you need to save your cinematics. They are super powerful and amazing tool, but they are something that you have. They are something that you have to know how to use smartly, and use them for the stuff that you actually cannot do, or would be with gameplay, or would be very expensive to do with gameplay. So super expensive set pieces and so on, showing character emotions, because cinematics, like with close-ups and current like mocap techniques, are an amazing thing to show with cutscenes. But really try to save them and show as much as you can with your designs. So another key thing, it's a super hot topic in game dev in the last years. Everyone talks about holistic design. So yeah, I'm a strong believer in holistic design. And I believe that the story and the plot and the narrative, they're all kind of just, and that comes from your writers or narrative team, is just one element. Like, if you hope that this writing department will allow your game to have an amazing story, well, that just cannot happen. Like, all other departments must become storytellers and must support the writing team in their own way. So, from the very start of your development cycle, if you are serious about telling a narrative through gameplay and a holistic design, you have to adopt such an approach. It's a high-level topic that begins early on in game dev, I believe. And basically, what is holistic design? Well, all of the elements created for the game, be it art, freezes and mechanics and gameplay ingredients, levels, the story, everything is created so that each element complements each other, and they can coexist and make a wonderful whole consistent experience. So, and the last key thing, we'll talk about this a bit later, is how to create what I like to call a design arsenal. So basically, as a level designer, you have to create a level. So what are your tools, apart from, of course, geometry on the level? You have a lot of like player abilities, you have a lot of gameplay ingredients, like, I don't know, explosive barrels, interactable doors, and more complex stuff. You have the game systems, if your game is systemic, and many other things. And basically, these are your tools to be able not only to create gameplay, but to tell a story. So this is probably the most important thing if you want to create interactive stories. And in general, this might seem simple, but I believe we shouldn't underestimate players. I believe games too often underestimate players in many ways. We give, as I said, like too much for free to players. We think, but what if they don't understand the objective? But what if they don't find this vital piece of information? And sure, there are things that you must kind of spoon feed them and kind of create these golden paths and guide the players with the invisible designer's hand, but generally, try to show less players, make them become active, make them participate, and look for these story bits on their own. Like, leave them room for player agency. You don't have to explain everything. You have to keep the mystery alive, as mentioned already. And another element to don't underestimate players is that they are smart. I mean, the majority of them, hopefully. And your characters should also be smart. Like, too often we create characters that are not really rational beings, like they're there just to serve a purpose, like to give us a quest, but would this character actually give you that quest? I mean, if you're walking down the street, would you just approach a guy and ask him, hey man, what's up? And he'll tell you, I have this trouble at home, it's killing me, can you help me? Yeah, real life doesn't work like that. And of course, we have to gamify some stuff, but you should often ask yourself, will this character act in this way? Will he interact with my character in the way he's or she is interacting? And this applies to all of the elements when creating a character. You can create these characters like to be totally believable, but again, challenge yourself, and you're going to achieve, I believe, better results than we usually go for. So try to create living, breathing beings out of your characters. Don't just create them to serve the needs of your gameplay. I mean, they will serve the needs of your story, but you shouldn't just create them for that. And this doesn't mean you have to develop them in tons of detail from the very beginning. Like Pavel Sasku made an amazing speech yesterday, and I strongly believe in what he said. You can create an amazing character with just a few kind of high-level sentences and then use these as like kind of your guiding line for these characters' actions. But yeah, these characters have to have their own goals, their own motivations, their own reasons to be in that game, not just serve the player and give you fetch quests or something else. And then you can extract ideas from those characters, like when you create them to be believable, when they have their own stories to tell, you can actually decide like what quest that character could give you or what kind of gameplay she or he could be involved in later. So the same thing applies on a bigger scale for the whole game. There were also lectures about creating believable worlds and world building, amazing one from Katya yesterday morning to kind of open the whole event. And actually, this is an amazing tool to tell stories as well. Like your environment should tell stories, and not just by environmental storytelling. Like when you create believable locations and societies and the politics and the events that happened before and during your game events, you can extract tons of ideas for player gameplay and interactivity there. So use that opportunity. So one of the main things in the presentation today is how to structure your development with narrative in mind. Of course, this is just one way to do it. It's not your silver bullet to achieve narrative through gameplay. So we're going to look at a kind of a very simplified version of, I wouldn't call it exactly a pipeline, but it's different elements that the game consists of. So you have your story with some of its like high-level elements like the story itself, the free act structure, the main character, the side characters and their personal growth and so on. You have your world building and some of its elements like the biomes, the society and everything involved in that, those societies, the architecture, and most importantly for us as designers, the conflicts. Like they are super key to everything we do. And you have your game design. With all its super important things that you cannot create a game without, like free Cs, or like not any game at least, the character and their abilities, the game systems, the gameplay ingredients, or whatever other terminology you might be using for those different elements. And you have the level design and mission design and quest design included here. So you have your mission design and the breakdown of the story into missions. You have different locations and levels. You have objectives and challenges. And you have two a bit specific things for which we'll talk later, cutscenes versus gameplay, because this is what this topic is about to some extent, and already mentioned design arsenal. So a couple of disclaimers. I personally believe that it's a game and studio direction to have narrative through gameplay, and if you want to achieve this, your pipeline should be adjusted accordingly to this. This doesn't mean that this is kind of a super weird pipeline. No, it's a very kind of a traditional pipeline. But it does involve more collaboration between departments to achieve the holistic approach, and it does require more than the usual time, I think, for iterations. So it can be pretty expensive, again, depending on the complexity and size of your game and your teams. All the elements multiply, so yeah, if it's a AAA game, going with narrative through gameplay, the way at least I presented here, it's not cheap and it's not easy. So if your studio cannot fully support such an approach, it's not like you cannot achieve narrative through gameplay. You can, but as a level or quest or game designer, your tools would be somewhat limited. So you would struggle whenever you say, hey, instead of a cutscene here, can I actually tell that story through gameplay? If you didn't follow a process like the one I'll describe here, it's going to be pretty challenging. You'll still be able to do it, but again, with a lot of limitations. So let's start with the game process. Again, all of these elements can start in a very different order. That's not really what is important, but let's assume we have a story to begin with, like from the writer's team. It doesn't need to be fully developed, it will be changed later, and so on, but let's assume we already have enough to kick off work in other departments and not have a bottleneck. So after the story, or like along with the story, there will be a free act structure for it. We will have some details about the main character, hers or his journey and growth, and also the other characters and their arcs. and personal growth and goals, which is super important. Like actually in many games, many side characters have some sort of flat arcs. They don't always develop. Not that this is kind of a must thing, but it would definitely help if you have more details about them. And this includes villains and their henchmen and all of the other archetypes you might have. So you start outlining by, after this, because you have a main character already, you can start outlining your freezies and everything around your main character. And again, disclaimer, it can be the other way around. You could start with the freezies, of course, and the type of game you want to do. And ideally, you would be extracting a lot of what this character can do gameplay-wise from the main character that was created by the story team. And this actually is a two-way process because, of course, your gameplay needs might require your character that the story team created to be pretty different. So ideally, you will be collaborating, iterating until these two elements are aligned to an extent. So at some point, maybe simultaneously, you start laying the foundations of your world and the lore and all of the other world building elements. So at some point, you're going to have some details about all of those. If you don't have a narrative or like a dedicated big enough story team, this work can be created by the art teams, by the level design, ideally everyone in collaboration. And again, most importantly, the conflicts. Those conflicts must feature, I mean, again, depends on what story you're doing, but in many cases, it should not revolve just around like a player and a villain. There should be conflicts in the world. The players might participate in them. The villain's goals might be part of those conflicts. They might not. There can be side conflicts that are optional for players. And ideally, the other characters will participate in those conflicts. This is like really important so that you can later create gameplay around that. And at some point, when you have some of the story details, as a mission designer or like level designer or lead, depending on how empowered you are, you start breaking down that story in a mission structure, like in different acts containing different quests or whatever your structure is for the game. And you start using the free act structure from the story to kind of understand what's important for each mission. Like you don't have to go in detail right now, you just need high-level skeletons for each mission to say, okay, what's the main goal for the player here? What is she trying to achieve? What are the key narrative moments? Like what kind of emotions do we want to trigger in the player in this quest? What locations will be used, and so on and so forth. Like, and most importantly, what's the unique selling point of this mission if you have to describe it with one sentence. So a lot of these you would be extracting not just from the story, but from the world and the biomes and the architecture and the society, and again, the characters and the conflicts. Like, when you're even putting the high-level info of your mission, you should already think about which characters you could potentially, if you have, like, again, mechanics to support other characters, what other characters can you involve in this quest and level? And again, what part of their personal growth and development is happening here? Why are they there with you? Sure, to have some fun gameplay with a friendly NPC, but why are they joining you? Like, do they have their own goal? Is their goal aligned with yours? Maybe those goes against your players' goals, and these are all opportunities you could use not just to create believable characters and goals, but to extract gameplay ideas out of that. So use that. It's a super powerful tool. So moving on, when you dive in more details about your mission, so now you're past the skeleton stage. Let's assume you have a whole mission structure for the whole game, and each like level or mission designer starts doing the so-called like level design or mission design document or whatever it might be called, and you start coming up with more details. And some of the first ones I personally go for are like, what are the player objectives and what are the challenges I'll be throwing against the player to make this mission fun. So I continue with involving other characters, like who's the boss of the level, like who's the villain we're facing, or like the henchman. You don't have to see the villain the whole time and develop only her or him. What part, as mentioned, like of their growth happens here, and you start diving in the conflicts, and you start extracting all of your ideas for the gameplay from those conflicts. This is a super important step, and this would make you change your initial ideas for the design. Maybe already the skeleton you created before. When you start going in more detail for each mission, it might not work. Like maybe the world has grown since then. Maybe your writing team got down in more details. So now you need to start and adapt like the objectives you had in mind for your mission to base them on the conflicts and so on. But many times I found myself to kind of just try to create gameplay for a mission. I mean, I know the high level goal. Yeah, the player must kill a guy or acquire an item, and that's kind of it. But too often we skip like, but what's happening in the world currently there? Is there another conflict there? Why is the events happening in this location? I throw challenges against the players like puzzles and enemies to defeat, but what is their part there? I mean, they can't all be just cannon fodder sent by the henchman and the bad guy. They could have another reason to be there. Not all of them, but some of them. So yeah, I mean, extract that from the conflicts. So in general, your world building will serve as an inspiration for the locations and the events and so on. And this is where actually the super key, probably most important part begins happening. When you start like involving these characters, creating gameplay and objectives from the conflicts and so on, you start thinking about the tools. What if I ask the player, hey, I've involved another character, maybe I want them to cooperate and solve a puzzle together, so one character can pull some object, the other can pull a level, then enemies can jump, you can protect your companion NPC, or like whatever other gameplay you come up with. Well, assuming all of this is happening obviously in early pre-production or like even R&D, but should be early pre-production, I believe. You start coming up with ideas for gameplay ingredients for different systems that you're gonna need to execute your level ideas. So this is a process where you begin heavily collaborating with game design and programmers, obviously. So this is where the most expensive stuff could potentially happen. And this is where level designers have to be very smart in terms of like what tools you request, like what design tools you request. Because if you just start going bonkers with like, yeah, I need this systemic content to create a system that interacts with another system and then with another system and all gameplay ingredients to speak with each other, it's amazing, but it can quickly become very expensive. But assuming we're talking about a high budget title, this is the moment where you start requesting all of these things, all of these elements so that you can actually involve characters in your gameplay and every cutscene you have in mind, because remember, we already established the key narrative moments in this mission. And usually, as a designer, I'm thinking, yeah, we will have a cutscene here where the character will do this and that, and this event will happen. But we're here to talk how we can replace those cutscenes and involve the player. So this is where actually a lot of your needs in terms of ingredients and player abilities will come from. And eventually this will lead to not just systems and ingredients, but the ability for the player to interact with those systems. So yeah, this is where the expensive stuff happens, and this is probably the most difficult and time-consuming iterative process. So yeah, ideally you have the game design team and the programming team to support this, and you wouldn't go with like level designers just prototyping and hacking the shit out of everything and just creating custom content, because again, this has so many downsides I cannot begin even to explain in this lecture. Even though it's inevitable sometimes. We always ship these kind of, yeah, this is just a prototype, programmers will fix it later, and we ship it. And yeah, inevitably, like when you start requesting all of that stuff, this could lead to changes of your character and main character and the other characters, because you start requiring these characters to be able to do some specific stuff, and maybe this goes against what your writing team has already written down. So again, collaboration, iteration, each department have to compromise if you are serious about the holistic approach that this whole thing is. So you're continuing with your mission design details, and you're obviously at the step where you're converting these cutscenes, what you would usually go for to do cutscenes, to gameplay. So a lot of the game story, and again, those key narrative moments, you would traditionally do as cutscenes, but because we're taking a different approach, we start involving these characters and extracting the conflicts, and we want to create all of the gameplay we want out of this, and replace most of the cutscenes we can. And this leads to changes to objectives and challenges, because as soon as you start involving those characters, you need to alter your objectives. Like this is inevitable, and the challenges you throw against the players. And even if there's no characters involved, this will be happening. So this is where, in the previous step, all of the hard work in collaborating with game design and programming teams and creating this design arsenal, because for me, the combination of all of the player abilities and all of the ingredients you have to use as a level designer on the level, and all the systems and the systemic content you have, ideally, if most of these were requested, not just to create fun, but in order to be able to replace those cutscenes with gameplay, you would already, by this stage, have a powerful design arsenal as a level designer that you would use the cutscenes only if you really have to. So it obviously sounds like way more simple than it is, but everyone here is a professional. You know how difficult this can be, but I strongly believe this is the key for us to achieve narrative through gameplay, like through this design arsenal and the collaborative process that I was mentioning before. So how to achieve this? Like what comes first, like the chicken or the egg, like our favorite dilemma. And as I mentioned, there is any department can lead this process. You can begin with the story, or you can begin with the game design. It doesn't really matter, as long as we ultimately, it can be a top-down or bottom-up approach. That's up to what game you're creating for, what audience, and so on. But the key thing is to try to remove those boundaries between the departments as much as you can. You have to act as a whole team. It's very difficult, especially in this kind of remote work era, to collaborate that much. But yeah, I think that's the main challenge. And yeah, holistic design, I believe, is the key to be able to tell stories through gameplay. So we'll go to the topic that we mentioned, like about cinematics and cutscenes and how to replace them with gameplay. So I like creating like these sort of matrices for different sort of design things. Like design elements, of course, the placement of all the games here is super subjective. Let's not fight about each of them. They can be moved quite a lot around. And I try to use stuff like this just to kind of ask myself, where do I want our game to be, or like a specific element, like the level design, or whatever I'm creating the matrix for. In this case, I try to use this to have on one axis, just as a high level kind of, does this game achieve narrative through gameplay? And on the other axis to have like, but how much, like what kind of tools it uses, like cutscenes and text and stuff that doesn't really allow usually for a lot of gameplay, or does it use like some real-time scripted events and VOs and environmental storytelling and other things that could easily coexist while the player is an active player and not just a passive watcher. So there are a couple of takeaways, at least for me, from what I see here. I believe that if the games are less complex, they don't have like too many mechanics, and they're not like super big, like AAA titles created from super big teams, this process could potentially be easier. I think there's a couple of great examples here. Actually, one Polish game, this War of Mine, I think is an amazing example of telling like emergent stories, and most of them happen through gameplay. Sexy Brutal, I think, is just an amazing example. I think this game is the epitome of like holistic design. Anyone that hasn't played it, I strongly recommend it. You're gonna see that there isn't a single element in that game that is just there to serve only one purpose. Like all the mechanics you have, once you finish the game, you understand how tied to the story they are, and vice versa. So I think it's just an amazing example of such a game. And yeah, overall it's difficult, as you see from many of those games, if you've played them. I think it's not impossible, but it's more difficult to achieve story through gameplay if your game is banking on heavily on cutscenes and full motion videos and so on. So all of these games manage to tell their stories in different ways, and even manage to achieve narrative through gameplay in their own ways, which again, for me, tells me that there is, again, no one way. Each game can do it differently. And there's some philosophical question in the end. Can we really call it narrative through gameplay if there's not that much gameplay? There are a couple of games here that are kind of more minimalistic in their gameplay, and vice versa, like stuff like Dark Souls. I mean, it has amazing world building, lore, etc., but a lot of the story is implicit. I mean, there is story, but it's really on the background. So it's kind of a different example. So yeah, I cannot answer this question. So early on in your project, you have to based on what target audience you're going for, what market, etc., and what your team composition is. You have to like aim where your game, you want your game to be in such a matrix, not just this one. Probably would go through a more complicated process. And ideally, you would be basing your goal on your team's composition. Like if you have a super strong cinematic team, well, you will have to go with more cinematics. So what are the other ways you can achieve your narrative through gameplay, or vice versa? Or if your team is one in the making, then your recruitment should ideally be tailored to the type of game you want to create. So we can't bother going in detail with this, even if you could read it, but maybe you can. And the text is not that small. So yeah, this is another thing that I like doing. It's like breaking down the different cutscenes in different tiers. Some of these are not cutscenes, obviously, like a companion NPC is not a cutscene. But basically, these are some of your narrative, traditional narrative tools. And because I assume you might have cutscenes, I believe many modern games do cutscenes in a different way. Some of them way more interactive, some of them not. Some of them actually, like Half-Life is a great example of like how the player can go around. Like you have limited abilities. Maybe you cannot attack NPCs. Maybe you cannot interfere with the cutscene, but you have freedom of movement, which makes you an active participant. There are games, actually Half-Life does this as well. Like the cutscene cannot fully progress without the player interacting with some elements. Maybe a character invites you to help him or her out with like pressing a button or entering an elevator or doing something else. So I believe if you have cutscenes, this is the way to go to an extent at least. So try to divide them in different tiers. You don't have to stick to only one, but say when you want to show off the cool stuff, when it's stuff which is very difficult to shield, like in level design terms, so that the player doesn't break the experience, well, go for non-interactive ones. But whenever you can allow the player to move around, move the camera, interact with stuff, and maybe, yeah, not jump around and break stuff while some important narrative event is happening, this is why you need to put restrictions. Try to go for these as much as you can. And ideally, you would go for a lot of real-time scripted events, like games like Arcane, games like Dishonored are amazing at doing this. They're telling stories constantly around the player through other NPCs and mechanics and systems, and the players can actually even interfere with those and have different outcomes. So I think that's an amazing way to tell a story. And to the right side, we had companion NPCs like God of War, Last of Us, super expensive stuff, but it's an amazingly powerful tool to be able to have a character that can do a lot of those same things the player can, or a bit less. So I won't go in detail about these pie charts, but basically you have to do a sort of a distribution of how many of each kind of cutscenes you want to do to tell your story, how many different elements you want to use to tell your story, like how much text there would be, how much VOs and like audio logs while the player is playing, so how much to invest in such a mechanic and so on. So it's a good idea early on to try to establish what would your approach be in distribution and how heavily you would use the different elements. So going to the last part of the presentation, like the level design process, we don't have time to go in too much detail here, so I have just a couple of high-level goals, and then I'll present sort of a super simple example with some elements of creating a mission. So yeah, I like to apply the free act structure not only on kind of when breaking down the whole story into different quests. I think it's very applicable to use on a per mission or like per level basis, like or worst case a whole act, which is like maybe a couple of quests, but they can each have their own like free act structure. So you have sort of a setup, then the conflict develops, and at the end you can have some sort of like conclusion, so that the player, even if she or he sat down and played for like 20, 30 minutes tops, which is let's say a regular session for like premium games, they still have this sort of fulfillment, and you maybe made even some planting and seeding or like some setup for the next quest to keep them hungry. So the other thing is, like, we usually as designers, when we start creating these missions and the documents, we start creating these like graphs with like tension and so on. But what are the graphs really about? I mean, are they really only about the difficulty, like when you have the spikes in the graph and when you have the drops to release the tension, or are we talking about player emotion? the emotions you want to trigger in players. Movies do it in one way, but games are kind of inconsistent in my experience with this. So I usually like creating two different graphs, one that that focuses on the player emotions I want to trigger in players, and another that focuses on the gameplay challenge, and actually see if these two match, because in most cases I see that, yeah, I want to trigger this emotion, but my gameplay doesn't support this, so I have to adjust it, or the other way around. So yeah, I mean, there will be compromises that have to be made, but I think it's a good way just for you to verify if you're on track to tell the story and trigger the proper emotions in your mission. So ideally, as mentioned before, you would be designing all of the objectives in your mission and all the challenges you throw at the player and make other characters participate, and you would be all basing this on the conflicts. I talked about this already. So you should be promoting player agency. You should allow players to make decisions through gameplay. This doesn't mean that you have to have a branching narrative and dialogue options. This is just one way. But if you give the player the ability to kill an enemy or spare him, or have an interrogation system like Metal Gear Solid, these are all powerful tools that not only allow for emergent storytelling, but if you're creative enough and want to use it, you can use it in many different ways for missions. So allow players to do that kind of stuff. Allow them to use other ingredients and mechanics to kind of create their own experience. Your game doesn't need to be an immersive sim to aim for something like this, but that's why actually immersive sims are pretty good at telling stories through gameplay. And in general, you could create some sort of a loop. It doesn't need to be exactly the loop I describe here, but you can come up with a template that you give narrative-driven objectives. Remember, they're based on the conflicts and all the other story elements. Then to allow the player to execute those objectives through gameplay, and then once they're executed, to reward the player with both narratives, so set up for future events like denouement, conclusions, and so on, and plan stuff for the next events, and also reward the players with gameplay, like advancing with the game, giving them skill points, and so on and so forth. As mentioned, there's a reason why I'm repeating it. Don't give players too much info at the start. Make them earn it. Okay, give one for free. But the other story details, usually when I create an objective, or when a designer creates an objective for a mission, they do a kind of an information dump. You have to do this and that and that. And I'm okay, maybe we can remove some of that. Maybe we can just keep one element and let the player review the others later. So this is something that again, we often, I think, underestimate, how to keep the mystery alive and keep the player guessing what's behind the door, what's this all about. So yeah, also mix up the way you tell your story. I mean, you could stick to one element, that's certainly an approach. But if your game is more complex, I think it's a cool idea, even if you emphasize on one type of storytelling, to kind of use the explicit and implicit and some emergent storytelling, then to use cutscenes and texts and VOs and tell stories through gameplay. So once you kind of establish your tool set to be aware that you have all of these different means to tell your story, then you can easily recognize how to use them to achieve your goals, and not just do everything through cutscenes. And yeah, establish those patterns and templates to tell your stories. Decide on when do you give players a specific kind of narrative exposure, and so on and so forth. And then once you establish these patterns, try to break them. You want to make your content unpredictable. If the players can easily recognize those patterns, they know, okay, I did this and that, so now I'll get a new cutscene, and then I'll get a new objective from that cutscene, or whatever we are talking about. You start losing the player's interest. So when you establish those patterns and templates you create your missions and content with, you should find creative ways to break them and find this balance of not doing inconsistent stuff, because that can be bad, like breaking player expectation, but also finding ways to surprise players. So in the very last bit here, we're running almost out of time, so we won't have a lot of time to go in details here, but let's imagine we have a very generic mission. So let's say there's two main events that have to happen in our mission. We have to kill some bad guy, like a general. He's not the main villain, he's just a henchman. And we have to save a prisoner. So where is, we would begin asking some questions, and designers, hopefully story would have some answers for us. If not, we can come up together with those answers, because we would need them for our mission. So what is the location? Let's assume in our case it's a Caribbean island, coastline, with a town and a fort or a castle. What do we know about that target? That's one of the main questions we got asked. Well, he wants to gain control of the coastline. It's part of kind of a bigger scheme. This is not his personal goal. This is actually the main game's villain's goal. So you're actually trying to move the main villains and kind of introduce players to them more and kind of develop the main villain as well. The general maybe has some other personal motivation. Maybe he wants to prove himself and live up to his father's name. So therefore, maybe we assume, story didn't tell us this, so his father was a legend. So can we build something around this? We won't be able to develop all of the stuff I mentioned here, like in this quest. I'm just kind of trying to give you fuel to drive your imagination later what you can come up with. So who is the prisoner? Do we even know he or she is a prisoner yet? Maybe we don't. This is the time to ask. Maybe we can postpone some of the stuff. Maybe we're just looking for a person and we can ask narrative, hey, can we change this? Maybe we're just looking for a guy or a girl to provide us with intel or give us an item or a means to access the castle or the fort or whatever. So you start approaching narrative by trying to maybe remove some of the information to not give it all to the player or to adjust it to your needs. So he's a local rebel, but again, do you need to know that in advance? Maybe no. Make the player earn it later. He has a personal agenda with the main villain. This is also something that could be revealed later. And later this character could potentially, especially if we develop him better, could become a sidekick for the protagonist. Maybe we throw in a couple of traits. He's weak, agile, or another stereotype. It doesn't really matter. So we already have a couple of key narrative messages we want to convey with our mission, like build the characters of all the personalities of all the characters involved, build a local conflict, which is super important. It's not just about that general and our prisoner. We already have info about rebellion, so okay, there is something happening if our guy was a rebel, and so on. And basically by you killing this general, you will be getting in the way of the main villain. So you get to allow the player to do that. So let's assume we have the first part of the town. The first part of the mission is the town. Assuming our game is an immersive sim with semi-open environments, like rather complex to have all the tools. So obviously the first act is a good opportunity to have more narrative exposure. So you can allow the player, like maybe his first objective is just, hey, go and find your contact. You don't know where he or she is. You just have some information about their name or looks. And you just let the player explore. This is what we need to do more often in games. This doesn't need to be an open world game, but we need to give the player the agency to reach the objective on their own. So this way the players can learn more about the world, they can learn more about the conflict, they can start, and actually what's the general's effect on the community, because we say, yeah, he's a bad guy, you need to kill him, but why is he a bad guy? Like, show me he's a bad guy. And you don't need the villain to participate there, like not the villain, but the general. You can just see the consequences of his actions. So you have your environmental storytelling. You can, hopefully you have the budget to create events around the world to show how he's harming the local community and why there is a rebellion. Maybe he took control of the fishing in the area, so the fishing boats are under his control, so people cannot provide food. He destroyed the bridge to disallow access because he's maybe paranoid. Another trait for his character, you could use that for your gameplay if you want. He destroyed the bridge so that maybe nearby cities don't come to help the locals. But this had other side effects. Now the local people cannot trade. Maybe they don't have clothes. They don't have other stuff they need. Maybe the general also took control of the local warehouse and is kind of distributing the medicine because his soldiers need it as well. So now people don't have medicine. And you can go on and on and on and come up with these ideas till the end of time. But the idea is you need to show that guy is bad and why the community is against him and why potentially the player wants to end this, aside from his personal, like, go and beef with the main villain. And while exploring the level, as mentioned, yeah, we find out that the rebel is, that our target we're looking for is a rebel. So you learn that he's part of the local rebellion. How you learn this? Well, maybe if there's a rebellion, there's clashes around town. Let's assume, because this is pre-production and we're designing our mission, we ask, can we have different factions and make them fight? Ideally, if we have this capability, we will be creating a dynamic environment where the players can actually see those conflicts in another way and participate in them. So ideally, maybe the player, like you don't have to give him an objective, like kill the bad guys there so that they give you the information about, like the rebels give you the information about the person you're looking for. No, you just create some conflicts and allow for the players to participate in them and make them feel that they're the ones that took the decision to do this and therefore move the story forward and get the information they need. So allow for player agency, like allow the player not only to interfere with those clashes, allow the players to explore, acquire information, be it through speaking with NPCs, entering houses. Again, games like Arcane's games are amazing, like this Deus Ex as well. They really promote player exploration and actively involve players in their stories. So you could help the locals in many ways, like we already created a couple of events and problems in the area. So allow the player to solve those problems, not just by killing the bad guys and that's it. Maybe you can do something to kind of help the locals gain control of the fishing boats. You can use different ingredients. Maybe they're locked, so you use a mechanism to unlock those boats. Maybe kill a couple of bad guys. That's what we do in games. Maybe you can fix the bridge that we mentioned before. How to do that? Well, maybe you have some mechanics, you can get some tools, you can get some machinery, bring it there, maybe do something mechanically. So again, this is the time to request mechanics that will allow you to do this later, because again, we are assuming this is our super high level mission design document and the point where we can communicate this with other departments. So yeah, you can repair the bridge. Maybe you get also not just narrative benefits. Maybe this gives you an extra access to the castle, which allows you to not enter guns blazing through the main door and so on. So this is what I mean, reward the players when performing those objectives. I mean, you are completing those objectives or side optional objectives by gameplay means, and you're getting narrative rewards. You see maybe you see just a bit of the changes now, because right now we're planting. We don't see the payoff yet of all the good deeds we're doing here. But yeah, also reward people with gameplay. When you allow the players to explore, they would get different items around. They would understand more about the conflict, more about the general, his father that we mentioned before, and all of the other narrative elements you want to develop. But don't spoon feed these to players. Let them explore and acquire them on their own, and this way they would really appreciate them more and care about them more. And you can be planting some items that players could use later. Maybe there's a local person here that tells you, yeah, my brother, he's working for the bad guy, but he's not really bad, please spare him. We need to get rid of the general, but maybe don't kill him. You can recognize him by a specific trait or whatever. So you start planting stuff about the general as well. Maybe you learn about his weaknesses, his strong sides, that he's a super strong horse rider, or when he sleeps, or whatever, so that you give the player different tools to kind of tackle the objectives eventually and solve the problems. And later in Act 2, which is the main act in which we develop the conflict, you enter the fort and you start getting payoffs for a lot of the things you did earlier. Not all of them, but some of them. So when you start infiltrating such a fort, one of the payoffs, like we mentioned, maybe if we fix the bridge, we have a way to go around some of the defenses and enter the castle in an easier way. I know these are generic examples, but they're just the easiest to use for me, just to kind of give you ideas. Or maybe if you acquire this item, which is a rope, even though it doesn't look like it, maybe you can scale a wall and again avoid more guards. So, or you can fulfill some of the requests that citizen made earlier. Like they say, hey, if you take care of the ballistas that are defending the fort, we can help with taking it over, so allow the player to do that. How to do it again? Well, sabotage it. Come up, maybe you have explosive barrels, carry them there, carry mechanic, put them, blow them up, destroy the equipment. Again, you're doing it through gameplay, or just push the ballistas off the wall. Whatever means you can come up with. And these are sort of mechanics that you could use later for other missions and do tons of other stuff with them. So we mentioned the ability to maybe spare enemies and allow the player to make these choices through gameplay. A character already requested that we spare a specific NPC. Don't, again, put an objective marker, like save that stuff. Let the player find that character by the specific traits that were described. Maybe he has a weird walk, maybe he has a hat. But this way, the players actually start noticing these details. They learn about that character. Why is he crippled if he's walking in a different way, or whatever? So this is also part of the narrative. What if you save that character? Well, he might give you a key or like key information. So maybe if that guy, like, so you free the prisoner that you were looking for, forgot to mention this. And if you spare the guard and you just put him to sleep, maybe you can kind of pickpocket him and get a key. Maybe this is the key to an armory. And let's say previously, we can actually go back, because here at this phase, we would be starting to come up with ideas, but they would look too convenient for the players, or they wouldn't be explained well. So this is where you can go back in the design and start planting some stuff, so that what we do at this point in the quest doesn't look like super convenient coincidences that just look bad. So this is a back and forth process. So let's assume this guy gives us a key to an armory, but what we could do in the armory, well, maybe we could start a fire in the castle. So then maybe one NPC earlier told us that, yeah, this character like had a horse, like strong horse rider, super afraid of fire, like think Game of Thrones, the mountain or something like this. So that's an advantage the player could use. So you'll be getting some payoffs as mentioned. And super importantly, start involving that character. This is a good turning point in the mission where you've changed the gameplay. So you might have now you have a sidekick NPC. Start using her or him. Like, don't have him just tag along. Make him like, you know, classic stuff like Resident Evil, 2 levers to pull. He pulls one, you pull the other, or like he does something while you protect him and so on. Start involving him, and this is a great opportunity to have conversations between the characters. And again, since you're getting a lot of payoffs of what you did earlier, you again have the agency to explore the location more, or maybe even plant more stuff for the end of the quest and so on. So surprise the players, as mentioned before. Okay, we did surprise the player when he entered the town that, okay, his point of contact wasn't there. It turned out he's a rebel and captured, so now you find him, but you were expecting this character to be able to aid you like a strong fighter or like super agile, but it turns out he was tortured and he can barely walk. So now you actually have to get him out, but he's getting more in the way than actually helping. So you have to balance this out. And this is kind of, again, a dynamic change to the plans of the player that not only builds this character and what happened to him and who caused it and so on, but it also changes the gameplay, which again is our aim. Maybe this character has conflicts that also surprise us. We were thinking, yeah, he's on board to kill the bad guy, but unfortunately, he tells us, yeah, let's kill him, but don't please use fire, don't blow up stuff, because there's like ammunition here, our people and community would have to use that, you cannot lit the whole place on fire. So now you're giving the player the opportunity to make a choice. Do I make the combat later easier for me by lighting up the place, or do I fulfill what this guy is asking from me? So it's, again, you're allowing the player to do this not in a dialogue, but what he does on the level. And this is our ultimate goal. And Act 3, with which we'll end, is basically you get all the payoffs for everything you were doing earlier in the mission. You get to face off the bad guy, everything we learned about him, we get to see now. Again, maybe we use the fire mechanic, maybe like Psycho Mantis, we were listening for those 1 hour long cutscenes, like how he's the greatest psychic in the world, but actually in Metal Gear Solid you get to see that. Psycho Mantis controls your friendly NPC there. He turns her against you. You have to use non-lethal means to get to kind of progress the combat. Then he reads your mind and you can attack him. And other cool stuff. But actually, even though many people like blame Metal Gear Solid for those 1 hour cutscenes, it's kind of infamous for it. Well, it does a lot of things better than most games do. And Psycho Mantis is just a great example of this. This is narrative through gameplay for me. So yeah, if you free prisoners, they can join the fight, they can turn the whole place like upside down, which would remove challenge from you. And don't forget, the last thing about the mission is to have a closure, like allow the player to loop back to previously visited locations if that's possible. Not in every mission, maybe at the end of an act, maybe at a different point, and let the player see how her or his actions influence that environment. What are the changes that occurred in the community, in stuff being rebuilt? Maybe the fishermen now are fishing, there's fish on the market. If we help them, the bridge is fixed. There's carriages carrying goods, trade is going, and so on and so forth. Like I can't give all the examples here, but you're creative people. With what we planted earlier, I'm sure you can create amazing stuff. And remember that not all closures have to be positive. Like some of the stuff that the player did or did not do could lead to negative closures, and leave some to the imagination. Maybe you don't get to see all the closures, and that's just the way it is. But the main thing is keep the players active, give them the agency, and reward them for being proactive and discovering the story on their own. And the summary of all of this, like the key takeaways for me that you could potentially inspire you, is like narrative through gameplay for me, fortunately or unfortunately, is a high-level game direction that ideally your story studio would support. Your pipelines would be tailored to support this so that you are empowered as a designer, and you would be able to achieve the holistic design approach and get the design arsenal you need to do everything we're talking about here and much, much more. So use your cutscenes smartly and tell your story in an interactive way and allow the players to do those decisions in gameplay. And for this to happen, your whole team has to understand how stories are being told. They don't need to become writers. I'm not a writer, but you have to understand some of the basics like free act structure, hero's journey, and so on. So yeah, this is everything on this topic. Sorry for keeping everyone later. And unfortunately, we won't have time for Q&A, but I'll be at the Flying Wild Hog booth. We're recruiting amazing storytellers, like level designers among many others. So feel free to swing by and chat. Thanks, everyone.